no different in that one of those folk that puts thoughtful comments and questions all over these feeds, but also interactions that I've had over the years with him on Twitter means that it's a bit of a crime that he's not been on one of the first 100 shows, really. But I hope this can be the first of many, as long as I don't make any mistakes and can make him and you can make him as welcome as he deserves to be. It's David Poulter. He's joining me to talk about a few things. But one of the main ones I really wanted to get him on the show was to talk a little bit about his career, but also how that recognizes that the ups and downs and ins and outs of various different modalities and styles of care, because he's someone who's been a few years in the game. He mentioned to me last week that he noticed as I'm celebrating my dad's birthday that he's older than my dad. And so he flagged that with me. I didn't quite realize that. But it does mean that his experience is such an interesting and enriching thing for us to reflect on and to learn from. And he's someone that shares an awful lot on social media for those who follow him at Retlooping, if you don't already, and you're missing out. If you're one of the few that's missing out on Dave's feed, then get over there at Retlooping on Twitter. Now, we've just had a few entertaining technical issues. That means that we couldn't quite get the sound working, and then he came in on video and he was upside down. And so as far as I'm aware, I think we've sorted them out now. And so I hope with a couple of clicks, I can bring in David Poulter. David, can you hear me?
Morning, Jack. How are you?
I'm not so bad, and you're the right way up, mate. So I think we're winning. Now, I've just given a bit of a potted intro, and I'll let you do the same in a second. But it gives me great pleasure to have someone on whose accent I share. You know, it's been you grew up similar spot to me in the world in Lancashire.
I think we're probably 10 miles apart. I grew up Great Orwood near Blackburn, and you grew up in Burnley.
That's right, yeah.
We probably need subtitles for the Southerners to understand us.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, it's our show, and therefore they need to adapt to us, don't they? We'll send out transcripts later. But you and I are going to crack on with a chat about old times and about how new times might reflect them, really. But before we do, can you give us a bit of a bio as to what your story is, and if you can condense that, if that is.
Holy crap! So 38 years. I qualified in June. So
wow.
I'll put it down to the potted history. So originally trained. I was one of those horrible remedial gymnasts when I first trained. You know, the ones who just did exercise. How times have changed. That's a perspective of how times have really changed, because now all the physios want to do exercise.
Right.
So I trained originally at Pinderfields in Wakefield after doing a science degree in Sheffield. So I was more of a mature student, 3 years ahead of my peers.
Right.
Brief history, I didn't get into MSK in a big way until I left England and I emigrated to Australia. So if I give you a brief look at my career, first job, OBGYN and special care baby unit in Wakefield.
Wow.
Did that for 9 months and then thought I better leave. General ward rounds, rotation in the old hospital rotation system, stroke care, general medical, chest care. Then I left and went into industrial medicine in Leeds, working for the government. Then I did a year in psychiatry, of all things, setting up a psychogeriatric program at St. James in Leeds. And then I left that. And all these jobs I left because I needed more money. You had to go up the grades and change. We had a baby on the way, so we thought we better need more money. And then I went to community care in Skipton and Harrogate area. And Haworth, doing Bronte country, visiting people in farmland. So basically, no MSK apart from I was the PT for Dewsbury Rugby League. So
right.
So I worked full time in the day, and then I worked at nights at the rugby club and Saturday and Sunday A and B team. So that's where I got into most of my MSK stuff was doing rugby, or as I call it, placebo ultrasound and taping. And then I emigrated to Australia late 80s. To an outback clinic, sort of a bush hospital. The government was looking for PTs, so I emigrated out there. Spent a year working for the hospital and then set up my own private practice. And that's where all my sort of MSK training came. I went through all the Maitland courses, and then just by chance went on a McKenzie course. And then that sort of set me on the path of where I've eventually ended up. I met Mark Laslett on my B course in Goulburn in Australia, and Mark became my mentor. So we've been sort of associated for 30 odd years. Spent 6 years in private practice in Australia, went on to New Zealand to do my diploma course in McKenzie, one of the first participants of that course when it became formalized. Met Robin, he was one of the tutors on that course. And then he asked me, I had such a bad experience, he asked me to teach the course. It was basically complain enough and he gives you a job. So basically, I left the McKenzie diploma course in April, and by June I was back there as the tutor. So I missed one course, sold my practice, moved my family to New Zealand, and then started teaching the McKenzie course with Robin in New Zealand and developing it. 3 years into that, we decided to move the course here. So I now live in Coombe Rapids in Minnesota. You wouldn't choose to come to a place like this, but that's where the course moved to. So hence I've been here for 26 years. So taught that for 6 years in the US, and then parted ways for reasons which will be kept private, and just started developing my own courses and teaching through. I worked as a clinic manager here in Coombe Rapids, and then I taught around the world. So I've been teaching my own patient-centered courses probably for the last 26 years.
No, that's fascinating and an amazing journey, both clinically and, of course, geographically. Then you've really got around. So one of the things that I've mentioned to you in starting is there's so many different things we could cover, but where I really want to get going is certainly it's often claimed whenever anything is fading away, they'll say, "Oh, it'll come back around," or the notion that never throw anything out, because eventually we'll kind of come to realize that it should be there. Now, that has good and ill to me. It's like that sometimes means that people, the bad side of it is that people therefore make that excuse for clinging on to things that they should be moving past. But then other times, I think it is sensible to be respectful of history and to be respectful of where we've come from, and to recognize that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater before, and therefore it seems clumsy if we were to do it again. And so that's intention to me. However, what's central to it is this notion that everything comes back around. Does it, Dave?
Does it? That's a really good. I pondered on it because I wondered what we discussed. So I pondered on this over the weekend. And you can tell me, if you look at my Twitter feed, it's my thoughts being projected out into the world. And then people's responses come back to me. So the thing I pondered on is, I think the biggest things I've seen is this move from modality-based in PT, and I think we discussed this. Me training as a remedial gymnast, we were always frowned upon by the PTs as the lesser part of rehab, because we didn't know how to use the magic machines. I used to be impressed when they take a fluorescent light and run it around the shortwave diatherm and it light up like a lightsaber. So then all of a sudden it's transitioned where it's all come around to everybody wants to be practically what a remedial gymnast used to be, which is exercise-based rehab. So in my trend over 30 years, I think we've seen this modalities wax and wane in and out. But I think some of it is we live in our bubbles. Because if you look, there's still people using, I know we criticize therapeutic ultrasound, but there's still people using it in America on a daily basis. So it's being taught and it's being utilized. I know there was this thing about somebody put up a university the other day and said, what the hell is this about? Well, the reason it's still taught in America, it's still on our board exam. So until that changes, it's this thing of change and progress are slow, like a slow moving oil tanker. They take time to turn around. And some of it is the tradition of having an exam base to qualify in America, which hasn't changed or updated. So the schools still teach to that exam. And I was talking to somebody the other day, and people don't realize in America, you can qualify and get your doctorate in physical therapy, but still not be allowed to practice because you haven't passed the board exam. So it's not like the UK where you get your degree and then you're free to register and off you go. So if I look back at my career, I looked at this, I think it's this thing of, the thing I've seen most is the change from resting everything through to moving everything excessively. We went from this rest. When I first qualified, people don't realize this. I was looking back. My job as a young PT was to go on the ward and entertain. I was like Billy Butlin's Redcoat, because we have these we probably have 20 17-year-olds up in femur traction, and they'd stay on traction for 12 weeks. So you've got these young kids rotting away in a bed for 12 weeks on traction, which was the standard go-to treatment for a fractured femur. If you look at back pain, when I first qualified, you'd be in bed for 6 weeks on traction. And basically it was a set of weights that kept you in bed because they used to touch the floor. It wasn't treatment. It was just this will keep the old guy in bed.
And I remember hearing about the creative rehab that would be occurring there is sling suspension. You know, you get the femur
exactly
elevated, and you get them to do some abductions against the pendulum gravity, wouldn't you?
Well, I don't know if it's an urban myth, but all those old beds that had the cages above were actually to stop the Germans knowing that we had shortwave diaphragm working in the hospital. I'm not sure that's true. I always think it's for sling suspension. But then you look online and there's this red band group that are now bringing back sling suspension. So that has come back in vogue in Italy. So that's come round again. And then we went to the era of moving everybody excessively, where continuous passive motion was introduced. And we can see everybody had to get on this machine and do excessive. And even the McKenzie Institute produced a Repex machine that did thousands of repetitions for you. So we went from this rest era into excessive movement era. And now we've gone, I think, from the excessive movement era to the famous just load it era, as I call it. Everything's just load it. And it's like, so basically, if I go back in my career, I think what we're doing is just, we've progressed from realizing that immobilizing everything wasn't the way to go. I used to remember that we immobilized those kids, and the biggest problem was when they recovered from the fractured femur is they had a knee that was now arthrofibrosed. So they had a great femoral union, but they used to have manipulation under anesthetic every other week. We used to have clinics where we saw people just after having the manipulation, we'd do mobilizations of the knee to try and keep these arthrofibritic knee. It was just brutal.
Oh, wow.
So I think what's happened in my career is we've seen this move from, well, if you take an ACL, you used to cast an ACL after surgery for up to 12 weeks. Can you imagine what happened? And then you wonder why you have a stiff, sore knee. You had a fantastic ACL, but you didn't have anything else. You couldn't move your knee. So we've gone from this realizing that joints need to move. And some of the work on, this is why I like research, because some of the work done showed that you can weight bear and keep cartilage healthy. So you don't need to just stick it in a cast. You can have movement. We can unload. So the trend I've seen is that we've actually looked at the physiological evidence and realized you don't need to cast everybody or stabilize them. There's this trend too that surgery's improved. I looked at surgery, and arthroscopic surgery has enhanced how we look at invasive surgery. The trend that people won't realize is I've been qualified 38 years, and that is the era where CT scans and MRI were developed. 1970 CT scans, 80s MRI. So when I first qualified, the only way to scan somebody was an X-ray. So if you think now, if you're a young PT, how would you cope if the only modality you had to scan anybody was just a plain X-ray? So things have definitely improved, but they've improved to the point where we've overutilized all this stuff, as we see, because we see that MRI findings are just as common in asymptomatic people as they are in symptomatic. So we're going back round to maybe we shouldn't be overused. And I think it's a trend. We overutilize everything to the point of we decide that we should probably back off.
So we overutilize what's novel, don't we? I mean, that's we can't help it. It's sort of new shiny thing, and that doesn't necessarily need to be modality, does it? It can sometimes even just be style of practice or a phraseology, a slogan, and just load it. Your manipulation of Nike's slogan amuses me most weeks. What I suppose I wonder is, do you think you've kind of mentioned there that you've got the clinical practice and the way of doing things that kind of is the norm at any given time, then being challenged by some research, and that is a really appropriate tug of war, whereby if research gets carried away, we end up reducing people to numbers and statistics, of which you and I clearly from our prior interactions we're just not fans of. But then similarly, dogma ensues if we don't get sense checked by something with an appropriate control group played against it. And so has that tug of war always been present, or is that something that I'm just witnessing that very tight rope at the moment between those two things?
Yeah, I think that if I go back to when I was a young PT, so imagine, I remember the first microwave coming to the hospital where I worked. So that's how old I am. People don't realize. I remember the first McDonald's arriving in Manchester because my now wife, my current girlfriend, went and bought me a Big Mac and a microwave, wondering what the hell it was.
Wow.
So we think about it, it's hard as a young PT to step back in time and realize that there wasn't any research. I remember, and I keep posting them on Twitter, the only avenue you ever had to complain or get your point across was writing letters to the editor. I have numerous letters to the editor that I write throughout my career, but that was the only way of communicating change.
Right.
Research wasn't a big thing. It's back to this, what is it, GobSat, good old boys sat round a table decided everything. Sure. It was traditional medicine. It was eminence-based. And I think if you look at, everybody thinks evidence-based medicine's a new thing. Sackett's paper was written in 1980s, late 80s. And it's this biopsychosocial model that was written in the 70s, late 70s. So we're talking 40 years-ish that we all now have rediscovered the wheel of, oh, we should be doing biopsychosocial. I had a conversation with an older therapist with Evie Martin the other day. We were discussing evidence-based medicine. And we were saying, we don't feel like we've changed much in the way we approach patients. I think being patient-centered has been something I've been ever since I qualified. But it's now just got a new name for it. It's become, the new norm. Everybody should be biopsychosocial. Well, if you go back to Engel's paper, I think it was written in 1978. So if you're just becoming biopsychosocial now, how modern are you?
Worry about who's been a machinist or a mechanic, essentially, right, or reductive to that degree for that period of time. You've touched upon something that I think, admittedly, it tickles my bias because I recall us being very well aligned on this and frustrated about some of the straw men as we saw it being played in the biopsychosocial discussion, as if there was this narrow reading of those original papers, Sackett, Engels, etc., that were then inferring that those models were therefore rigid and therefore judging modern times as if they couldn't have been through layers of semantics, of changes, of adjustment. Of course, the most relevant thing for me in the biopsychosocial model now is how it is being how are we interacting with it as a reasoning framework now, rather than it being what's codified as if it's a religious scripture. Am I categorizing our agreement there fairly well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember you talking about it, saying it might have been the JSOPT editor that you'd met at a conference, and she said, oh, this is what biopsychosocial should entail. And you said on your show, that's what I do anyway. You're assuming that that's not what I do. And it's back to this implicit assumption that we all follow it's like a common knowledge thing that I write about, that common knowledge isn't necessarily common knowledge. And I wrote about it yesterday in a blog, going from I worry about this term patient-centered too, because it's like we think somebody's in the middle of care. It's like, well, there's a patient and here's all the care on the outside, like going from which it means focused. It doesn't mean centered as in the middle of. And I think it's the same when I talk about McKenzie's centralization. It means focal point, not middle of spine. We confuse the term center to mean what we perceive it as. And I think when we talk about patient-centered, we should be talking about the patient is the focus of our involvement with them, not the center of our care, but the focus of our care. And I think that's where the biopsychosocial model has been used as a blunt instrument to hit people over the head. And then they split it into three parts and say, well, I'm doing the psycho aspect of this with my patient. I've sent him to count. And you think, but that's not what it means. It's this thing I talk about. It's a pancake. It's like biopsychosocial is all one word, not three little bits that you think, oh, well, I'll send you away to a psychiatrist because I can't cope with you in my clinic. I always say to Mark Laslett and I discuss this. Every patient you see has some distress level. You just have to be aware of what that, even the most normal person who doesn't come in looking distressed probably has some distress. It's just that they're not amplifying it to you during your assessment. So everybody has a biopsychosocial presentation. It's just which players are the key parts to it.
Yeah, I think that's what I've come to be frustrated by, is that essentially it's it feels like, and I don't think it's always purposeful, but it feels like a convenient academic argument to suggest this is why it's like however many ways you can consider something reductionistic or reductive. I always get those mixed up, but it's like that it's sort of a lofty assertion that this is this is being considered contemporary practice, but actually it's just as bad as was, and everything will come back around. And it just feels like the same sort of thing whereby there's this sense of higher wisdom that's being inferred, whereas actually language is malleable, practice is malleable, reasoning heuristics, of course, are malleable. We can't always know that we're speaking the same language. The only reason I think, that's why I'm such an evangelist for conversation, is because it's kind of like it takes for you to say, what do you mean by that word? Just to check, like define your terms. It's not complex. It's more just, let's just make sure we're on the same page so we don't talk past each other rather than rushing ahead so that one of us can feel smug and one of us can feel stupid. It just feels a bit redundant. Now, that speaks to a lot of your work to me at the moment, is that you're always wanting to be thorough and clarify terms and as you say, spill your thoughts, of course, on the internet as well. But as far as where you keep your finger pretty close to the pulse still, how do you think we are at the moment? Do you think do you witness us making similar mistakes of old? Or do you think we're carving out some decent new corners?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm in an echo chamber like you. See, we agree because we're in the same echo chamber. And I told people I actually have 4 Twitter accounts. And I have one that I purposely call my right-wing account. And the way you get a right-wing account is you sign up and follow Donald Trump and his cronies. And it's amazing the different medical views you get and perspective by doing that. So, and I know you were going to have John Ware on before the election, and I know John and I have absolutely dichotomous and opposing views on everything, but not on how we see patients. So it's this discourse of you can disagree greatly on one subject, but have a commonality on another subject. That we actually agree on what's good quality care. So it's this thing of, I always put this thing out of ethos, pathos, logos, seeking to understand somebody before you try and spread your opinion all over the internet. And people mistake what I do on Twitter sometimes. Like I said, I prepare for talks and lectures and things by putting it out there because I want to see what the reaction might be before I actually get paid to put it out there, because then I'm being told I'm spouting rubbish while I'm being paid. So I use it as a sounding board. And yesterday I talked about this thing of, I'm not a great fan of big philosophical terms. I am an ardent numpty, and it's a great English term. I grew up in a working class family in Lancashire. I talk like this. It's 38 years since I lived in the UK, and I still talk like I did the day I left. It's because I always think this: if I can understand it myself, I can actually pass it on to a patient. And if I can't understand it myself, I'm not passing it on. And I have this struggle with this current thing of, this dispositional theories, and I think they're over complex ways of looking at the world that we've probably always done. So it's like everything else. You're probably already doing biopsychosocial. You don't need to label yourself doing it. It's become trendy to say, I'm doing pain neuroeducation. You're doing it. What does that mean? Good quality care is something you do by interacting with an individual. It doesn't mean, so if you take time, and I've changed this narrative too, I receive a history is a big paradox change to taking a history. I think if you could just sit down with a patient to say, I am receiving your history, you will become a better biopsychosocial practitioner, because that's the essence of it, is allowing somebody else to give you their narrative rather than you taking something from them.
No, it's a good point. I think one of the things that particularly fascinates me is that your take on the complexities of the language, etc., is something that I think is what resonates so much with people, is that they feel like, is it that I'm just not smart enough to comprehend this right now? Is there on the other side of that, am I being baffled by bullshit because there's plenty out there? It's kind of like people are just trying to bamboozle me on purpose. Or is it somewhere in between, in which, yes, there's some things I should aspire to know, but in doing so and pursuing it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to rock my world. It doesn't necessarily mean that these things are things I necessarily agree with. And also, this I've heard from a lot of people recently where they're like, I've paid a lot of attention to this particular thing, and I'm now that I understand it, I wish I hadn't wasted my time. I thought it was going to be something much more revealing to me. Right. And I think one pass that I give people maybe here on this with the philosophical stuff is that is exactly what I want my philosophers to be pursuing, is theory, regardless of its action at times. think what's interesting with Course Health, and good on them for doing so, is that they're trying to channel that into some. They found that there are, in their opinion, some tangible actions and differences there that can be applied clinically. Sometimes it can be a bit cart before the horse. I'm very involved in that work and that project, and I'm a fan of it. But I also think that they need to make sure that they clear up what they're, where the philosophical musings end and where the supposed implications for practice, because even though those things are blurred, it's something that they're coming across as far more highfalutin than I think they want to.
Yeah, and that's one of my points I made on Twitter this morning. I try to use my humorous puns as anecdotes for lay people of, this is what you've hit the nail on the head. I have this endeavor. I hate the word ignorance, and I don't mean that in a negative word. I try not to ignore things I don't understand. So my project for this last 6 months while in lockdown was to try and understand philosophical terms better, like you can see me tweeting about them, epistemology, metaphysics. So I've tried to, because I've never had a background training in them, to start to understand them. And I think I've got a pretty good grasp on them. The problem is, I don't think I've got a good enough grasp to do this thing, simplify them on the other end of complexity yet. So I keep tweeting about them, and then people keep helping me out. So I posted this morning about it's like the allegory of the cave versus the numbskulls out of the Beano. I'm still at the Beano numbskulls level. So these guys who live in my head. So I'm getting there, and that's my thing. I hate avoiding things for the sake of, oh, it looks complex. And it's this thing of, it's not complicated, it's complex. If it was complicated, I'd need somebody to help me work it out. It's just the complexity that I'm getting to grips with. And I think, even though I'll be 62 in April, I'm not avoiding these things as, the old dinosaur or fossil. I'm still quite happy to challenge my brain, on these things. I always say the famous, is it Michelangelo, ancora impera? I'm still learning. After 38 years, I'm just scratching the surface. I don't know how many more years I've got left of it.
Well, it's still something I say a lot when I'm teaching, and obviously even on this show, I imagine I've mentioned it a few times, is that to me, part of what's interesting about MSK is it is such a young and emergent discipline. And in despite, of course, I'm speaking to you at 38 years of experience on that journey, but regardless of that, it's compared to most disciplines, it is very young in every which way, and therefore there are going to be swinging pendulums, and there can be spectrums, and we can talk about, and it's interesting, and we should talk about it. But I'd suggest, and I'm gutted that the time's passed as quickly as it has, David. But for me, I just want to try and see whether we can try to get somewhere more mature than just suggesting that it all comes back around. Therefore, it kind of makes this sort of clumsy nihilism, like nothing needs to be done there because it all come back around. Or those that suggest that things should be ridded quite as quickly as possible as soon as we learn something from an emergent RCT or a couple. And those two styles that we see emerge sometimes can be incredibly frustrating. And I feel like your work really speaks to that middle ground of saying, hold on, lots to learn from history, but that doesn't mean we have to be tethered by that dogma.
No. And I think some of it is, it doesn't come back round, it's just rediscovered by somebody new.
Right.
It doesn't come back round, it's always been there, like the biopsychosocial model. It's always been there, you've just been taught it. So it's new to you. It's not come back round. Yeah,
and I mean, I'm going to just go, the biopsychosocial model, or call it what you will, is what I'm going to just say in all my education now, because I'm bored of that being like, aha, there's a there, it's like, this is what I mean by holistic, as if holistic as a word isn't challenging. The amount of people that have corrupted the word holistic with candles and the like. So I've been really selfish, and I've been hoarding your time and not necessarily getting the chat involved, and now we're out of time. But many thanks for those that have been commenting. Jo Turner said she loves the receiving history point that you've made there. I haven't heard that before, and that is a brilliant one. She also mentions that this comfort with not knowing until we do. I think that's one of the things that's hard, isn't it? Is that we do better when we know better, and sometimes that can lace us with a little bit of guilt. But we've got to move past it as quickly as we can to help ourselves and others around us. Evie Martin, if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it properly. I love that. That's nice. And then we've got a comment here from Bernadette. Sorry, Bernadette, it won't probably show all of it because of the it was a longer one. But years ago, patients were just that, people of whom things were done to them by clinicians. Now patients do and need to play a collaborative role in their treatment. Needs to be interactive, and all the information should be available to them. I'm sorry, I can't then see the rest of that, but I think that's a lovely point to end on. Bernadette say a patient who contributes to MSKR amongst other things, and so I think she's nailed it there, hasn't she? Is that
absolutely
it needs to be more and more collaborative. You know, we've kind of democratized education and participation through social media. One of the upsides of that is surely for us to truly get on level pegging.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I wanted to make sure I asked Dave is how have I got on? Are we going to do this again? Have I muckied me ticket, as we'd say around our parts?
That hasn't muckied that ticket, lad. I've done well.
Good. Well, we'll do this again sometime then, mate. And really do appreciate all that you do. And thanks for joining me on the show. What time is it over there? Because I know I've got you out of bed early.
Now, believe it or not, I was up at 2 a.m. cycling because I like to get 4 hours in before I start work. It's 7 a.m.
Brilliant. Well, you know, I appreciated your time even before I realised just how early I've managed to drag you up. But thank you as ever, and keep doing what you're doing, mate.